I finally published my beginner croissant recipe on the Baker Betty website. It's a recipe I have been working on for a really long time. And there are a lot of kind of like cheater croissant recipes out there, but these make real croissants. It's just a bit of a faster method. You're still gonna do the whole lamination process. It's just a much easier approach. And it kind of gets your feet wet before you go into full-on, classic croissant method. I wouldn't call it easy, but it's much more approachable than a traditional croissant method. I'm gonna show you how to do it step by step here in a video, but if you go to the Baker Betty website or if you Google Baker Betty croissants, you will find the really detailed recipe that has step-by-step pictures. You can make chocolate croissants with it, or classic croissants. These are reading much darker on camera than they really are in person, but croissants should have a pretty dark brown color, but I'm gonna show you how to make them. At least 30 minutes before you start your croissant dough, you want to take your butter and take about 2 tablespoons off, or about 30 grams off, and bring that to room temperature. And then the rest of the butter is going to go into your freezer. I like to do this the day before if I can remember it, because I want the butter to be really, really rock hard, but at least 30 minutes. And I really like to use Kerrygold butter. I know it's not French, but the thing that I like about Kerrygold butter is it has a pliability to it. Like, it kind of has a bendiness to it. It doesn't like crumble, it's not brittle. And that works for us a lot when we are laminating a dough. So it's my preferred butter, but you can use any butter you like. I use the salted, but unsalted will also work because there is salt in the dough. I've done it both ways. It doesn't taste under-seasoned if you use unsalted, but I usually use salted. We're gonna start by making our dough. I have bread flour in my bowl. I'm gonna add the rest of the dry ingredients in. I have some salt, I have some sugar, I also have some yeast. I like to use instant yeast. And we're gonna stir all of this together. And then we're going to take that 2 tablespoons or around 30 grams of butter that we saved aside to come to room temperature. And we're gonna add that in, and we're gonna kind of crumble this in, or almost like cut it in the way we would do if we were making a pie crust. I kind of want to just use my fingers and almost like rub it through the flour until it becomes a texture of almost like a coarse cornmeal. I'm kind of coating all of the flour with this butter. It doesn't have to be super cohesive, just kind of worked through, and it will almost look like a little bit of a coarse meal. And then we're gonna add our milk. Now, we are actually using cold milk for this because we don't want to wake our yeast up too much. It's gonna work against us a lot if the yeast is too awake. So I just have cold milk. You can use whole milk, you can use 2%, whatever you have. I like to use whole milk. And I'm gonna start by stirring this together with a spatula, and then we are gonna do a really, really quick knead on this. I'm not gonna knead it very much because at this point, I don't wanna overdevelop my gluten strength, or it's gonna be really difficult for me to roll out. So I just wanna knead it enough that will kind of bring it together into a cohesive dough. Little bit of flour down. And this dough is gonna be kind of stiff. You shouldn't need to add a lot of extra flour, but if it's feeling incredibly sticky, you can add a little bit of flour to it. But I just wanna bring all of the dry bits in and knead this for maybe 1 minute. You'll notice I'm just kind of pushing the dough forward and bringing it back. I'm not like squeezing it or pushing it down into the table. I'm just kind of like pushing it forward and bringing it back to me, letting it roll under my hands. Okay, once it's pretty cohesive dough, I'm just going to kind of round it up and put it back into my bowl and cover it up for about 20 minutes just to let it relax so that I can roll it out more easily. So we'll come back in about 20 minutes. Now that the dough has rested, we're going to roll it out. And anytime you're rolling out, you want to be kind of conscious about how much flour you're using, because if we use too much flour, the layers in our lamination won't adhere to each other, and you can end up with these giant holes in your croissant, which is not what we're looking for. So I'm going to shoot for around a 7 by 14 inch rectangle. The thing about doing it the way that I'm doing it now, though, is that it does not need to be exact. If you're making traditional croissants, you really do have to be exact. Because we would make a butter block that needs to have very specific dimensions, and the dough needs to be very specific to fit within it. But you'll see why it doesn't have to be super exact with the method that we're gonna use. But I kind of like to shoot for around a 7 by 14. You can come in and kind of tug on your edges to make it more rectangular and kind of squared off. Now that my dough is all rolled out, I'm taking the rest of that butter that I had in the freezer and I'm gonna use the large holes on my box grater and I'm gonna grate the whole block of butter. I like to do it into a bowl. I just find it to be easier, or you could do it like onto a sheet pan. Obviously be careful of your little fingers. When you get to the end, you can kind of just take that last little piece and break it up into some smaller pieces so you don't grate your fingers. Okay, all of our grated butter. So we're gonna make our butter block now with our frozen butter. And I'm just going to spread it out in kind of this middle section. I want about equal amounts of dough on top and bottom without butter. So this was about 14 inches. So I did about 3.5 inches on both the top and the bottom. I just kind of used my ruler to make myself a little guide. It doesn't have to be perfect. And now we're just gonna take all of this frozen shredded butter and just kind of pile it into this square and sort of evenly spread it out. I am gonna kind of avoid just that very edge. And this is the messiest part. You just have to embrace it. You're gonna get a little bit messy when you do this. Okay, and then once you get that in there, I kind of like to come in and just sort of very gently press it down to kind of make it an actual butter block. If we were doing this the traditional way, we would take a whole block of butter and kind of beat it out into a very specific size and make a whole butter block with it. But this is much easier and you don't have to be super specific about your size. Okay, so now we're gonna lock it in by bringing the dough up and over to meet itself. You don't really want it to be overlapping. You just want it to all meet. And I'm gonna come and pinch this together. If you have a lot of excess flour, dust that off. You don't want all that excess flour. You want it to stick to itself. So I'm just pinching that seam together, and then I'm gonna come in and pinch my edges. I wanna make sure all of this butter is locked inside and it can't really seep out. Okay. And now we have locked in our butter block. I'm gonna wrap up this dough with my butter block inside in some plastic wrap, and we're gonna put this in the freezer for about 20 minutes to just really kind of firm that dough up before we come back and do our lamination on the dough. We're gonna go ahead and start rolling this out to laminate it. Again, we're going to use a very, very small amount of flour. You don't wanna use too much. And you want to orient the dough so that seam that we created is going away from you. So basically we've rotated it 90 degrees. And now we are going to roll this out to do our first round of folds. I like to kind of take my rolling pin and just sort of lightly beat it to kind of soften it a little bit. And then I'm gonna start rolling this out. I'm not worried so much about the width, but I want to try to get this to about a 16-inch length. And I'm using a good amount of pressure, but I'm going across the dough, not down into the table, to just try to stretch this out. And we're gonna do something called a book fold, which is going to quadruple our number of layers. I like to pretty constantly check that I'm not sticking. If you need to, you can kind of come in and square your ends back off. I'm kind of losing my square shape here, so I'm just gonna kind of reshape that. It doesn't have to be exact, but you're gonna end up with a really, really thick piece of dough if you don't roll it thin enough when you're doing your lamination. Okay, so we're gonna do a book fold, which means we're gonna bring the top down to the middle, get rid of any excess flour, bring the bottom up to the middle, and then I'm kind of just gonna stretch these edges to sort of meet each other. And now we're gonna fold this in half to make a book. So that has quadrupled our layers. And now we're gonna do one more round of lamination. So I just folded this. I'm gonna rotate it 90 degrees. And now I'm gonna triple my layers. So again, I'm gonna do that light beating. I wanna try to shoot for at least a 12-inch in length this time. But one thing you're gonna notice with this roll is that your edges are gonna start becoming very uneven. So I like to flip my dough over every few rolls to kind of try to keep those edges a little more even. They're still gonna be kind of uneven, but it helps it a little bit. So now we're gonna triple our layers. This is called a letter fold. I'm gonna bring the top third down, and then I'm gonna bring the bottom up over that. Like you're folding a piece of paper to put into an envelope, like that. Okay, so that is all of our lamination. Now we're gonna just wrap this back up, put it back in the freezer for about 15 to 20 more minutes, and then we can roll these out and shape them. Go ahead and roll this out to shape it. Again, we don't want to use too much flour. Our goal here is to roll this out to about a 13 by 10 or 14 by 10 inch rectangle. I'm going to use my rolling pin, kind of beat it going both directions. Soften it just a little bit. And I like to do it on both sides. And now we're just gonna start rolling this out. Again, like I did when I was laminating, I like to rotate it quite a bit and flip it over to try to keep my edges as even as I can. They are going to get a little bit uneven. It's just, there's no avoiding it. I always tell people that when you get a croissant from a bakery, they are using a sheeter, which is a machine that does this perfectly for them. So doing this by hand, it's never gonna be perfect, but we can try to keep those edges just a little bit even by flipping it. Once you have that rolled out to at least a 10 by 14 inch rectangle, I like to take either a rolling pastry cutter or a sharp knife, or you could use a bench knife, and just cut the very edge all the way around every side off. This is going to expose our layers so we don't have closed edges. That will help our pastries rise as much as they can. I still save these scraps. I'll show you what I do with the scraps because we worked so hard to laminate that. I don't want to waste it. And then this is gonna make 6 croissants. So we need to cut this into 3 equal long rectangles, about 3 inches wide each. But I like to take a measurement to see how wide it is. Mine's just a little bit wider than 9 inches now that I've trimmed it. So I'm gonna make marks just a little bit bigger than 3 inches apart on both sides. And then I'm just gonna connect my marks and cut across to make my rectangles. Just like that. So now each of these rectangles is gonna make 2 croissants. If you want to make traditional croissants, we're gonna cut these into thin triangles. So what I like to do is I take my ruler, I kind of match corner to opposite corner, and then again with a sharp knife or a rolling pastry cutter, you're gonna cut across to connect the two. And then I'm gonna do 2 of these chocolate croissants. So if you're gonna do filled croissants, you're gonna cut them just in half straight across the middle to make 2 shorter rectangles. So I'll use this one for my chocolate croissants. I like to just measure and see how long it is. This is a little less than 12 inches, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Cut this in half, and that'll be my 2 chocolate croissants. So for shaping a traditional croissant, you're gonna take the side that's opposite your point and cut about an inch notch right in the center. And this is gonna help me create the points of my croissant. So once I cut that, I do like to kind of like stretch this out a little bit. And I also assess it. If there's one side that's kind of like butter starting to peek out a lot, that's gonna be the side that points up because it will become the inside of the croissant, and the smoother side should be pointing down because that will be the outside of the croissant. Mine looks pretty good, doesn't really matter. And I'm gonna pull these 2 little sides out to create my point, and then just roll that up. And I wanna make sure this is sitting right on the bottom, so I kind of press it down to make sure that doesn't unravel as it rolls. One more time, cut about an inch in. It could be a little bit bigger, that's probably a little bigger than an inch. Elongate this, pull out my 2 little corners, and roll it on up. Just like that. Now for a chocolate croissant, you can just use chocolate chips, or you can take a chocolate bar and just cut it into strips. These are chocolate batons. They're specifically for croissants. These are the Berry Calabo ones. But I'd like to use 4 total for my chocolate croissants. So I took 2 of them. I'm just sitting it at the edge. I'm gonna wrap the dough around that completely, add 2 more, wrap it around, and then again, I wanna make sure this is fully underneath. So I kind of take this little edge, I sit it underneath, and I press it down just to make sure that's gonna sit down on top of it so it doesn't unravel as it rolls or as it bakes. One more time. 2 more pieces of chocolate. Roll it up. And then make sure that's sitting underneath. And that's it. That's how you shape your croissants. You could do ham and cheese or whatever fillings you like. After you're done shaping your croissants, you want to put them on a parchment lined baking sheet and really spread them out because they're going to puff up a lot. And you're gonna cover them with plastic wrap and let them rise. Now you have a few different options. If you want to, you can actually freeze them. Right after you shape them, you can put them right into the freezer, freeze them solid, then go ahead and wrap them in some plastic wrap, and about 8 to 10 hours before you wanna bake them, so like the night before, you can pull them out, put them on a sheet pan, put plastic wrap over them, and just let them thaw and rise overnight at room temperature, bake them in the morning. If you want to bake them same day, you're going to let them rise and egg wash them and bake them. They're going to take at least 2 hours and maybe up to 3 hours, just depending on how warm your room temperature is. My kitchen sits around like 73, 74 degrees Fahrenheit. It usually takes closer to that 3-hour mark. But if your kitchen's a lot warmer, it might not take that long. And then you can also let them rise fully and then put plastic wrap over them and put them in the refrigerator and just bake them straight from the refrigerator the next morning. You don't really want to refrigerate them much longer than like 18 hours or so, but you can bake them straight from the refrigerator if you proof them and then refrigerate them. These are all puffed up and ready to bake. One of the things I'm looking for to know they're ready to bake is one, that they're increased in size and that they kind of have like a little wobble to them. But see how when you look at the side, you can see all of those layers kind of separating? That's a good sign that they're ready to bake. And now we need to egg wash them. Do not skip this step. They will look so unappetizing if you don't do this. When I was first testing this recipe, I didn't do it on a batch just because it's mostly about aesthetic, but it looks so gross. They look so unappetizing. So don't skip this step. So it's just an egg yolk mixed with, if you have a little bit of cream, that's kind of what's going to give you the best color. But if you don't, you can just use milk or even water if you don't have milk on hand. And you're just gonna very lightly brush this on the top of all of your croissants. I'm being gentle. I don't wanna deflate them as I'm doing this. These are gonna bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius for about 18 to 22 minutes until they're really dark brown. They should have a pretty good color on them. You don't want them to be looking all pale. Those ones that we often see in the grocery store in the US, those are not what we're looking for. We want a good dark color on these. They're out of the oven. They are so flaky. They are so delicious. This is the inside. It's not quite as even as a honeycomb structure as if you were to do a really classic lamination, but it's really good, especially for somebody who's just getting their feet wet. They're just so flaky and beautiful and delicious. I forgot to show you, this is what I do with my dough scraps. So it's kind of like a Queen Amman. I just take a muffin tin, I grease it with some butter and I sprinkle some sugar in it, and then I sprinkle a bunch of sugar on the dough scraps and just put them into the muffin tin, and it's just like this caramelized little like laminated pastry. And you've never had a Queen Amman, it's the best pastry ever. This is kind of like a little cheater version. Let me know if you make them. BakerBetty.com. You'll find the full detailed recipe. Tag me if you make them, and I hope you love them. Bye.